Authentication can be a seemingly complex problem, especially for us who build full stack applications. And there's so many opinions out there on what the best practice is to implement authentication and what methods you should use. So I'm gonna create this video where we discuss the best practices and what authentication method you should be using to keep your websites secure. So the first question that you would need to answer is your application using server-side rendering? And here we're gonna assume that it's not. So if it's not, let's just assume you're using Create React App. So the next question is, do you need to support all browsers? And here specifically, I'm talking about Safari. This would be because Safari is one of the only browsers nowadays that block cross-site cookies by default. So normal people who use your application, their cross-site cookies will be blocked without them even knowing. So do you need to support Safari? And if you do, it's going to be at a cost of security. So let's assume that yes, you want to support Safari in your application. So it comes down to you have to use local or session storage. You can't use cookies because if you're using Create React App, unless your server's on the same domain, which it most likely will not be, then you will have to use local or session storage. And this is vulnerable to cross-site scripting. So from here, you have two options, and obviously you can do authentication however you want. But in this video, I'm just showing the most common and probably the best ways to do it so far. So if you're down this road and you have to use local session storage, you can use sessions as your authentication method, and you can store user sessions in something like Redis or your database. And then you can store their session ID in the local storage. Or you can just use JSON web tokens and you can store the access token in local storage. So let's say that you don't really care for Safari, or you're just making a side project for fun. So here, let's go down the road where no, you don't care for Safari. Then you can just go ahead and use cookies. And obviously, whenever I mention cookies in this video, I'm going to be talking about cookies that have the same site set to strict and they're HTTP only and secure. So that means that basically the cookie cannot be sent to any domain. It can only be sent to the domain that created the cookie, and it cannot be accessed by JavaScript, and it cannot be intercepted from HTTP. It can only be transferred through HTTPS. So those are the secure options you would need to have on your cookies. However, these cookies are still vulnerable to cross-site request forgery. And honestly, you would rather be vulnerable to this than to cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting can be a lot more damaging to your application. Let's say you're down this road, you're going to use cookies. Well, here, the most common way to do it is you would use sessions in your backend and store the session ID in a cookie. Or you can use JSON web tokens. Maybe you have microservices or something going on. You can use JSON web tokens and store the token in the cookie. And those are basically the best options we got now, up to now, at the time of recording for single page applications. And I'm not talking about mobile applications, because mobile applications would be a whole different thing. They're more secure, and usually people just use JWTs in mobile apps. So let's say you're not using server-side, client-side rendering, and let's say you're using server-side rendering. Obviously, this is going to be a lot more easier for you if this is the case. So let's just say maybe you're using Next.js. Well, in this case, you really have two good options, and both of them involve cookies. So one option that a lot of people use is they store a JSON web token in a cookie, and obviously it's a secure cookie with all the options that I mentioned previously. Or you can use sessions on your backend and store the session ID in that cookie as well. Now, a lot of people think that you need to have an access token and a refresh token to do JWT, and I actually disagree with that. My reasoning behind it is if you have two tokens, a long-lived refresh token and a short-lived access token, where would you store that refresh token? If you're going to store it in a secure cookie, and then most people store the access token in memory or in local storage, I'd say that's pretty much pointless unless it's a very specific use case. It's pretty much pointless because why not just store the access token in the cookie instead of storing the refresh token in the cookie? Because either way, someone can still steal that refresh token, and then it's all over from there. Either way, these two ways of using cookies, they're also vulnerable to cross-site request forgery attacks, where attackers can send requests on a user's behalf. So at the end of the day, there's no such thing as being 100% secure. There's always some vulnerability. And you might be thinking, well, what can we do to solve that? And that's another question I wanted to answer. So here I made a list of how to do damage control or how to prevent attacks. One very popular method is to use two-factor authentication. So this could help if your database gets leaked and passwords get decrypted or something like that. You would want to use two-factor authentication with a limited amount of tries, so then they can't brute force it. You can do this for very sensitive actions like changing a password or an email, or maybe just for a login if a user wants to do that. You can also make the user put in their password to do those actions. You don't have to do two-factor authentication. You can make them type their password again. And to prevent cross-site scripting, you really should be sanitizing every user input, client-side and server-side. You want to just make sure that they're not messing around with your website trying to find out some vulnerabilities. You want to disable any input that involves the greater than sign, less than sign, or any special characters that could potentially be used to attack your application. And to prevent 99%, or I'd say 99% of cross-site request forgery attacks, never mutate through a GET request. Never make it so that a GET request changes something on the server or changes account info. Almost all cross-site request forgery attacks are using GET requests, and is where the attacker finds out a vulnerable GET request. Just a rule of thumb, do not mutate with a GET request. Use POST request instead, and make sure that you make things be sent through the body and not through the URL when possible. Another way to prevent attacks or damage control them is to encrypt and salt your users' passwords. This should be a no-brainer in 2022. Too many times websites have been attacked and clear passwords have been leaked, and that's just terrible, and you don't want to put your users through that situation. Alright, so yeah, this is pretty much it. This is what I believe to be the best way to do authentication nowadays using React. If you have any disagreement, just make sure to leave it down in the comments. I'll be happy to discuss that with you.